I think it might even be one of London's best kind of hidden stories. How do we redefine the experience, and how do we redefine it for everyone? What's really important is storytelling.
Well, first of all, thank you all for sticking around. My name's Mervyn. I've spent the best side of 40 odd years in the business of music, and hence why I'm talking to Olly, because Olly's equally as passionate and emotive about music, and I think we're very, very lucky to get 30 minutes or so with him. So you open this bar, 2 years later, 5 bars later, you end up with Lovebox.
I mean, Lovebox was interesting. It was originally at a club in East London called 333, and I think about 200-300 people used to go to it a month. And but it was great. You know, Groove Armada were coming through. It was early. It was just over. You know, the '90s was the dance scene, obviously, but then early 2000 was the like birth of Groove Armada, and like Basement Jaxx came a few years later. And they were doing something really interesting, and then you know, I was in Clapham, and I'd noticed that actually there was nothing going on in Clapham Common. There were no festivals at the time. This is maybe 2002. So I called up the council. I said, you know, would you ever allow a concert to happen? They said yes. And then the application process is quite simple. And then obviously you need someone to build it. So I found someone who could build, you know, the infrastructure and the staging and the lighting, and then you needed the content. So I talked to the guys at Lovebox, and they were like, "We're up for doing the festival." So suddenly it was a combination of, you know, you've got the location, you've got the guy who can build it, and you've got the curation. And I kind of sat in the middle and pulled it all together. And so yeah, year one was really interesting. We put it on sale, and I think 10,000 tickets went in the first 5 days. So that was the beginning of, you know, email databases as well. It's quite interesting because they had a very strong database, and they just put it out to their database. So I don't think we actually didn't spend any money on marketing. We put it through their database and we sold out the tickets. So that was year one. And then I bridged from kind of traditional hospitality. Now I was in entertainment. Right. So in entertainment, Bacardi sponsored it. And then within 3 years, 2003, 2004, 2005, I think we had 40, 50,000 by year 3. Yeah. And then from that moment onwards, other festivals started coming to Clapham Common. So it was interesting because there's also a touch of like regeneration. You know, regeneration, bringing culture, content to a place that didn't have it, working with a big brand. And I think, yeah, that was it. It was quite organic. So it was organic.
So you moved from Lovebox of 50,000 attendees over a couple of days to what? Then thinking, well, I want to have this on a weekly basis. So you look at the Camden Palace. How did that come into your orbit in terms of something that you wanted to have and something you wanted to curate and create?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it wasn't really at that period. It wasn't really wanting to have. It was, you know, it's like everything. When you do something well, people present more opportunities. That's what happened. So I think at that period, a friend of mine was an agent, actually. And he said, there's the Camden Palace up in Camden, and it's in a really bad way. Do you want to come have a look? So, you know, obviously I went up there, and I think this was 2003. Yeah, it was 2003. And I mean, that road, you know, Crowndale Road, the whole area was a mess. It was a bit of a mess. And it was quite interesting because the theatre, it was the end of the dance scene. So the Camden Palace in the early 80s was, for me, it epitomised kind of the best of British music. It was Duran Duran, Spandau Ballet, Boy George, Adam Ant, Ultravox, Depeche Mode. It was kind of endless. And then if you think of that era, that was the last great era of English music exporting globally to that level. So Camden Palace had a very important position in terms of fashion, culture, Vivienne Westwood, music. It was quite electric. But then 90s was about dance music, and I think people forget 90s live music dipped. You know, people, the 20-year-olds went to raves around the country instead of like live shows, so live dips. So by 2003, I don't think there'd been any live music in there for like 10 years, and there was no roundhouse either. So it was in a really bad way. So what really happened was it was just it was organic. It was like I was offered the chance to go see it. But when I arrived, I love spaces. So spaces I always find spaces interesting, how they work, how they look. And it was obviously a stunning theatre. I mean, the bones of it was all white. It was all, it was all beaten up, but it was absolutely stunning. And then I looked into the history going back from like Charlie Chaplin into Peter Sellers doing his Goon Show, into the Rolling Stones in the 60s, and you've got like Clash, Iggy Pop, AC/DC, all of that era, and then you get into 80s where it's Madonna's first London show, Prince comes back. And so yeah, you had this. If you look at the history, it was actually dedicated to an actress called Ellen Terry in 1900, and she was called the icon of aestheticism, and she was the actress of her generation. She was like a fashion rebel. She rebelled against the corset and kind of like wore kind of like this marvelous sort of like baggy clothes, which was a big deal for back then. So if you look at it, it's theatre. It was a cinema. Then the BBC owned it for 30 years as a radio, so it was about broadcast content. So for 30 years, it was all about making content. 60s and 70s are like the birth of live music, and it stayed with that into the 80s. And then 90s, it kind of falls off a cliff. So by 2004, I think it was just a rough diamond. But the history was there before I arrived.
So I remember us talking about the historical context of buildings, and me telling you the story of working for Motown and speaking to Gerald Busby, who replaced Berry Gordy as the president of Motown. And he once told me that his first day walked into the reception area and he saw pictures of Stevie Wonder, Lionel Richie, Diana Ross, the Temptations, the Jackson 5, and realised that actually he was just the custodian of this building, of this iconic vessel that was the cultural steamship of black music. And we talked about your feeling when you walked into this building and thought, oh my God, all these things, amazing things have happened in that building, and how do you feel now in terms of, do you feel like a custodian? Do you feel in that way?
Yeah, of course, because like I just said, the history was there. So of course, it's great to own it, but the reality is, what I'm hoping to do, and what I have been doing for almost 20 years, is preserving the culture and preserving that story. If you think about it, it's a London story. I think it might even be one of London's best kind of hidden stories. I think people know about it, but they don't know about it in its entirety and how it represented arts, entertainment, people, fashion. I don't think, because I think it's a bit of a misfit. It's on this corner. It's its own thing. So for me, obviously, I'm very proud. I'm very proud to have it. But I know, the objective of even what we've just achieved is that it should stay standing for another 100 years. So when we restored it just now, we stripped the paint back no one's stripped the paint back of that theatre since 1900. So, that was a full-on that was 3 years of restoration, working with craftspeople to kind of like bring back the theatre to its to its former glory, from every perspective. So if you think about that now, that should stand. In theory, it could be there, in good shape for another 100 years. And then I think buildings are only as good as people. But you can have history, but history can be lost. So this is where people come into, you need talented curators, you need people who take risks, you need people who really get it to create the content. So, but if you get the combination of the building, the space, the history, and you get your curation right, and then you get the energy right, and you bring it all together, that's when you can see movements happen. So I think from when I had it in 2004, that was my chapter the last 15 years. And I saw we opened up with Amy and, the Libertines and Block Party. And I just saw that come through. And that was a moment. And then obviously we did Stormzy's first show. So I saw how UK grime came through. So, in the last 15 years, I've seen multiple new acts from Dua Lipa, Amy, Stormzy, coming through the venue, but they're also representing a kind of time and culture in London's culture. So yeah, I think that's what we're trying to do, is keep that going.
And has your vision stroke objective changed from 2004 to today? Do you see, are you on the same path as you were when you acquired it, or has your journey moved a little?
Entertainment's very tough. You've got to stay relevant. You've got to stay relevant to be sustainable. Like I said, to be sustainable, especially in entertainment, you need to make sure you're keeping up with the times. So 204 to what I saw around 215 is obviously festival culture got richer and richer. You also had the development of like multi-tiered like hospitality, like Soho House. So you could see there was this move of like, traveling, festivals, experience, design, architecture, all of these things coming into play. So you could kind of see as early as 2015 that, the experiential economy was growing and growing, but actually people were going to want more. They were going to want great architecture, great design, great content, and in a multifaceted way. So that's what I saw back then. And then I was in LA around 2013, 2014. Actually, I met the guys from Twitch before that got acquired, and I was looking at the whole streaming space, and that intrigued me because I could see the birth of smartphones, and going back to what the previous panel were talking about artist and fan and how that might be the future, but you could see how streaming was going to kind of facilitate that. But as much as streaming was there, without the right story, streaming isn't really that important. So streaming is a mechanic, a distribution for a story. So what's really important is storytelling. So, with that in mind, when the opportunity came to take the 2 buildings at the back of KOKO, I was like, okay, how do we redefine the experience? And how do we redefine it for everyone, from someone who's only got like £30 in their pocket to someone who's a high net worth? How do you look after everyone, and how do you do it in an interesting way? And then from an artist perspective, we cabled the whole building up to stream in 4K and potentially up to 5G. And the reason why I did that was because I flipped it, looking at it and going, well, what happens when the artist wants to start talking to their fans, and what happens when they want to communicate in different ways? And if you think of TikTok culture and what Gen Z want, Gen Z have grown up in blended content. So they like their stories in handheld for 10 seconds, but they also like a series, they like a TV show, they like film, but they like a blended storytelling in blended formats. And if you think what the streaming does, the streaming allows us to do a 4K stream like we did with Nux and Stormzy. We did that on the launch, and we streamed Arcade Fire through Amazon. But at the same time, we can stream emerging artists and tell their stories through a sort of like short form, handheld format. And so it's about how can we tell stories, and how can we tell stories and stream them, but in different ways. So that's what we did. So that was the future proofing. And in 2015 pre-pandemic, it was actually quite hard to raise money on the back of that story. So a lot of people were very interested in, tickets and drinks, and they were like, we like this, but we don't like the streaming element. And I persisted with that. And I got many no's. And where I got fortunate is my partner today is in content and creates content. So they believe in IP, and they were like, actually, we like the idea that you're going to create content and potentially IP and work with brands to tell stories. And then the pandemic happened, and then through necessity, people needed to monetize their stories. So post-pandemic, that's why I think we've hit a new era with artists, where it's not to say everything's got to be streamed. It's more that I think that will come into modern day storytelling. And now the building allows something organic, no phones, rock and roll, just back to simplicity. But at the same time, if a brand or an artist wants to tell the making of story, from their sound checks to their day in the penthouse to how they go down the lift, who they meet and greet, all of that all of that rich content which is lost. Now the artists can kind of maybe monetize it, or at least they can showcase their story, and they can do something on the main stage and stream that. So now they can really take their fans on a journey to really see what their process is about, really see who they are behind the scenes. And I think that is groundbreaking, because no one yet is really telling that kind of story. It's quite literal right now. You know, you watch a live stream on stage, but what is everyone doing on TikTok? They're looking for the offcuts behind the scene. That's what's really... So I think the building, being able to stream from 7 different rooms right now, means that we can talk to talent, emerging talent, and obviously big talent, and work with them and create stories in a modern way.
Yeah, to me, it absolutely captures what was said before in terms of the venue, and in terms of being directly accessible to the fans for the artists, but also the way that it's not intrusive, because you've got the cameras already built in. There's nobody following you around. It's kind of purpose built, and and if you haven't seen it, you should go and have a look, because Olly does these amazing tours. Lasts about 2-3 hours, but it tells you everything about every single aspect of the place. It's amazing. So tell us about your members club now, the House of KOKO.
Yeah, the House of KOKO. So that's over 5 floors, and there's 16 rooms, 16 different rooms, and I mean, the design intent was like, it was quite fun, was like, how do we look at KOKO's history and actually bring that into the design? So firstly, I worked with the architect for 4 years, because it was 3 buildings. There was a piano factory building from 1800, and then there was a pub on the corner, the Hope and Anchor, 1860, and I think that pub was built to serve the piano factory builders beer. And then the theatre was built in 1900. So it was, how do you take 220 years of history, put it in a new building, and then how do you make sense of it? So that was years of sketching. And then that was 4 years in development. Then working with the interior designers, it was, I think the most important thing we had to do is we could make it new and modern, but we had to pay homage to the history of the theatre. So if you look at the materiality of the theatre, it's classic. So we had to make sure everything we did in the members' house was classic. So you'll see a lot of brick, fabric, woods, carpet, because all of those things existed in 1900. So we could wander through different design languages, but never betray that classic element of the theatre. So that's how I think it all ties in.
And you and it's very unique to Camden. I know you're very passionate about how it sits in the community, why it sits in the community. I mean, you tell so many different stories about what was actually in Camden. You know, when you told me the other evening about your foundation, and in terms of bringing music back to schools, and that there was the oldest piano factory in the world was here in Camden. I mean, it's worth sharing that with this audience, and just let them know the relevance of KOKO and what you intend to do with the foundation.
The piano factory part's quite interesting, because Camden was the centre of the world for piano factory making from 1870 to almost 1910. And then Germany took over with Steinway and Yamaha, but Bengough Street, the last parts maker, shut in the pandemic. So that was the last piano factory parts maker just here on Bengough Street. So you know, when I was rebuilding KOKO from 219 to 222, it wasn't just the building; it was redoing the brand, because we're coming back as a brand. We're not just coming back as a building. And how does that brand talk to our audience? And how do we want to do it? And it was obvious we'd done a lot of very good things in the community previously. But now was an opportunity to crystallize it. So we just got charitable status on our foundation. And that was really important to kind of, how do you create a commercial business, have a charitable foundation, and how do you give back? So within the membership, 5% of all the membership fees goes to the foundation, 2.5% of sponsorship goes to the foundation, and merchandise. So we managed to create a commercial model that then gives money to the foundation. The foundation does 2 things: community programs in music and the environment. So our first couple of programs were building trees, funny enough, in some of the council estates because they've got no trees. So we thought, why don't we do something small and tangible? So that started with 2 council estates, and we built 20 trees. And then that's kind of grown to like, I think the next program will hit 100 trees. And then the Sainsbury's Foundation found out about it, and they've just joined. So what's good is we've joined up with Sainsbury's, and we're going to try plant trees in 40 boroughs across London. And at the same time, then we're going to create music programs. And then what's great is some of those artists can come play in the cafe, because you need grassroots venues. That's why the cafe is so important, because we break new artists, we break unsigned artists. We've got the radio launching in February. That's great for emerging artists. So the cafe and the radio dovetail well, and they're like the pre-story of the theatre. So you've got emerging talent breaking the theatre, then the cafe and the radio kind of break the grassroots, and the foundation hopefully will help artists go to, learn through producers and writers, and then maybe perform at KOKO.
Yeah, it's also interesting the fact that there's so much, especially in this time of financial crisis, there's so many publicly funded venues in London that are going by the wayside. So in 3 years' time, where do you see KOKO? Because obviously it's not publicly funded. You've got a commercial model, obviously, but you still have to be do you see yourself being the cultural centre of London in terms of music? Because you've got art as well inside the building. It's absolutely amazing. Even, I've got a friend who used to be a buyer at Christie's telling me about some of the art that you've got in the building. So it's more than just a music venue. It's a cultural venue that it's private, not public.
Yeah, and that's what the Members House actually allowed us to do. We've got some great musicians who are members. We've got a lot of artists who are members, digital artists, creators who've all become members. So I think the house allows us to create an art collection, which we've done, showcase digital NFT art, which we're doing, and then expand the programming. So in the last 6 months since we've opened, we've worked with London Design Week, so we did their main event for London Design Week, and then we actually created a panel within the Members Club with people like S. Devlin, who's obviously designed the Brit Awards, and so now we're creating thought leadership panels around design, and then we hosted also Freeze Art Fair, and then we also worked with 10 galleries and emerging artists, and some of the artists that we put on the wall, some of the paintings that we bought, are now represented by some of these galleries that we're working with. So I think what's fun is we can now straddle, obviously music's at the core. I think we'll host 1,000 musicians in our first year, but then we're into think art, digital art, and they all talk to each other. So we're now working with other groups, partnering with other groups, and I think we're lucky because we're independent, and I think real creativity happens when you don't have too many people involved. When it's creative by committee and you pass it down too many layers, you lose a bit of magic. And I think we've got some really, I work with some amazing people up at KOKO, head of music, head of art, head of electronic dance, head of digital art. So I've got 7 or 8 curators, and they're allowed the freedom to really, it was interesting listening to the data approach, and I agree the data is going to be, it's a massive opportunity. But at the same time, there's a human element, and the human element is certain people just get it. They've got instinct, they've got taste, they know where things are coming, and I think those are the people I've always worked with, and I understand them. So once you get those brilliant curators in a position, and they feel they can do what they do best, that's where you get the real ripple of where culture is kind of born, because you need to be, music and culture is innovation's part of it, because you've got to take risk to break content. Yeah. So you need people to have the freedom to book in an unknown act or big act or an act from different countries. You need that environment. So that's our lucky part, is that brilliant creatives who are allowed to do their thing very well, and then the brand, our brand partners allows that all to kind of come together, and then we obviously share that with everyone.
And in terms of brands, what kind of brands do you think resonate with the essence of what you are that you've implanted on the people that work with you and for you? What kind of brands carry that same message?
I mean, I think the brands that are interested in curation, in culture, in understanding where tomorrow's audience live, where the next sort of like innovation's happening. So, round one, it's interesting. We teamed up with a crypto platform called Luno. We've got a great partnership with Diageo, and then YouTube came in, and YouTube only came in because we brought in the content element. So now we can begin to see from beginning, this kind of opening few months from working with those brands, is that they're all interested in, where culture's moving and where music's moving. And I think, being closed from 2019 to 2022 allows you to see there was this gap. And what I've seen, which is fascinating now, is like London's going to sit between America and all the US talent. We're always going to break great artists here. And then lastly, the big moment is there's amazing music coming out of South Africa, Afrobeats, Amapiano, out of North African rap scene. And the big labels are going into Africa. So KOKO in the last 6 months have done, like one of the biggest artists out of Ghana. We hosted Burna Boy, Black Sheriff. So we're sitting in this, and those artists will come to London before they go to America. Yeah. So London's now geographically going to sit between, American artists got to break London, European got to break London, and Africa's got to break London. So I think London's going to have an incredible opportunity to kind of like sit in the middle of all of the, of the future of music.
Well, I've been lucky enough to spend a bit of time with Olly and asked him a number of questions, plenty more than the ones I've asked tonight. And I just wondered, are there any questions out there that you'd want to ask him yourselves? Anyone a question for Olly? Is somebody?
With the proliferation of social media into the fan experience over the last decade, what predictions would you have in how fans will be experiencing music in the next 5 to 10 years?
I mean, I think what TikTok's done and what's going to happen is, TikTok proved that music is now being used as part of the creative process. So people create content, but you need the music to make it emotive. So I think the next 10 years is, I think music's about to be, I think content hasn't even started, in my opinion, because you're going to have like driverless cars, Web3 is going to connect everyone together, and all of this time and connectivity is going to mean that your future audience will need more content. They're going to need more content, and then the creators are going to create more and more content. So like content that they create for things like TikTok. But then when they get into Web3, they're going to create virtual content. So once they start creating virtual content, they're going to want to use music for their virtual content. So I think where it's all going is that music will still be listened to in a traditional way. And we know connectivity is going to improve, and we know 5G is going to improve distribution and proximity. But then music's now also going to be used in a totally different way we haven't understood, in terms of how do you use music to bring other forms of content to life. Like film needs music. The best films have got great music. The best content in the future will need music. So music is going to be ever present and grow, but it's not only going to be listened to in its traditional form as much as you have now. You'll be listening to it in 5-second bursts, 20-second bursts through characters. And I think people are going to start creating Web3, NFT, digital content. And that content is going to be, that's going to break new music as well. It's a little bit like why Drake and everyone wants to be with the streamers. So the biggest artists out of the US want to be with streamers, because that's how you're going to hit audiences. So it's streamers are going to come into the play. They're going to dictate things, but also look at Roblox, right? So imagine when all of those millions of people in Web3 start needing music, and they start sharing music with their fans. So I think music is just going to continue, and it'll be democratized even more.
Yeah, I mean, it follows on from the previous panel when they were talking about the next 10 years, what will the next 10 years look like. I think KOKO has kind of prepared itself for the next 10 years in terms of what they've done. So it'll be interesting times ahead and certainly worth waiting around for. Any other questions?
I think the whole story about KOKO and what you're doing with it is fascinating, and the different facets of the business. And you talked about sort of different curations of music, of art, of culture. How do you personally decide which way to go? Because obviously the world's constantly evolving, and what you've done over there is incredible. Having taken a wander around, you're right, Mervyn, it's a beautiful place. But how do you make the decisions going forward for the next 2-5 years for what you think's right and the way to go for the business?
I mean, I think it goes back to, we're a house where we create content. We create experiences, and those experiences are physical, and then ultimately we want them to be streamed and be live and digital. So it just comes back to storytelling, and really that building now just allows great storytelling, and it allows us to tell different types of stories because you've got different size rooms. Like, for example, when you want to fill up the theatre, you've got to sell 1,000 to 1,500 tickets. The cafe, we don't need to monetize, so that allows you to take more risks. The radio allows you to take more risks. So to answer your question, I think by developing smaller things and things with reach like the radio and with the streaming allows us more actual creative freedom to work with musicians. But actually, I think where it's going to go is I think streamers are going to come in, and I think not just streamers, TikTok creators. There's going to be a creator economy, and you can just see. I've got a 16-year-old son, so I can see from his lens when I see that he knows his music, but he'll also watch stuff that I think is quite dumb. But it doesn't matter. I can't be old. I've got to look through his eyes and go, actually, that is relevant, and that guy, as mundane as he is relevant to him like things were relevant to us when we were 18. So you have to remind yourself. Once you remind yourself of that, then you can see that they're in the R lane, but they're in a new lane, and there's going to be a whole world of creators who aren't actors, they're not musicians, they're not anything we know, they're a new breed, but they're going to have a following, and they're going to have a following with their audience. So I think where it goes with us is the building allows the freedom for musicians, obviously, but also for creators to come in and collaborate with us, create IP, so we can tell new stories to a new audience.
There's a couple of hands up.
Hello. You talk a lot about, content and where it's going, and building in itself is obviously limited in its scalability. Is there a plan in the future to create more KOKOs? Is there a plan to have this base of, a space where content can be created and, in a sense, culture protected with this physical space? Do you plan to open more KOKOs?
I mean, that's not actually the plan right now. The plan is, I've got a lot on my plate with this. It's a huge building. And we've got to tie our shoelaces up properly, meaning we've got a lot of work to do. But then the exciting thing is I'm just seeing the level of talent I'm seeing in that building right now, and what goes on in that building, and the ripple of new musicians from all around the world who fly in daily. And sometimes you've got 3 shows going on in the whole building, and you can't hear either show. So you could go to 3 shows in one building and see different artists from different places from around the world, and you can see someone just starting their career, and different audiences. So, for me, that's fascinating, and I think that's what the building has allowed. The building has allowed that kind of that dynamic culture to be actually just happening all day. And then I think as we go forward, if we can if we can capture a bit more of it, we can work with brands, tell the stories correctly, program it right, and then programming content works when it's continuous programming. It needs to be repeatable. So I think the next phase is, first phase one was just to stream some content, work out the building. The next phase is, how do we do it weekly, monthly? What are the formats? How do we communicate those formats? Because once we've got formats and the building, then you get into a new, then I think it could be very interesting for not only the big musicians, but for emerging talent. We've got a massive problem in London where 50% of grassroots venues have closed. And, we still go, in a good way, we go on about the Stones and Bowie, but people forget they broke in the pubs, the arts clubs. You need grassroots. So, the grassroots pubs have been forgotten about. There's no government money. And then, I'd say the big corporations, they want to sell volume tickets. They're not interested in a band who gets, who's only got like 1,000 followers. They're not. There's no money in it. So you'd be surprised how there's not that many groups who want to take that type of risk. And I think that's what we're doing. So I'm proud of the fact that we're going to not only break a lot of acts in the theatre, we're breaking unsigned. So every week now we're breaking unsigned talent. And then when we launch a radio, we'll enjoy that even more. So I think that's how we're going to push culture and push music in London through that way.
And I think it's fair to say that you're only in second gear.
Yeah,
You're only in second gear. And it's not even on full cylinders yet. So there's a question here.
Hello. Yeah, it's kind of piggybacking on the last question. It's around from 2002 when you opened or bought the first bar and moving to the success you've had today. Do you think that approach is still realistic today in today's culture, environment, etc.? And if not, what are the catalysts, or what approach would you have taken if you were starting fresh today going forwards?
Do you mean the platform that you can create back into?
Just more of how your kind of business, how you've grown throughout the last 20 years.
I think he's talking about your passion. What drove you then, and would it be the same required amount of drive now in this environment? Is that what you're saying?
No, more looking more as an approach to similar-minded kind of entrepreneurs who want to go, I want to get to where you are, let's say in 10 years' time. Is there a similar approach? Can you go bar to bar going steady up, or is there a new with the kind of social media with catalysts? How does that evolve? Yeah.
Let's think. Listen, it's always hard. But I think what's really good for entrepreneurs today is startup culture from the US has come over, and that wasn't there when I was early 2000s. Tech culture didn't exist. I think it was much harder because there were many projects I embarked on and people wouldn't listen. So I think now what's great about today is, look what's happening in food tech, agri-tech, climate tech. Like someone comes up with an idea and there's capital available. So that's a totally different London to even 10, 15 years ago. So you need capital, don't you? And then you need to be brave. And every entrepreneur just faces the same thing. There's no certainty. So actually, that same level of risk is the same risk as 20 years ago as today. You're either going to go in and enjoy that risk and enjoy that challenge 20 years ago, 20 years' time. That's all the same psychology. So psychology is the same, more capital available. And then it's about your choice. It's about choice, strategy, people, which I think is the same as 20 years ago. So there's just more different. I think things are more multi-layered now, aren't they? I think the world of the 360 is truly here, in that every brand will have to talk through physical experiences, content, shared content. It's no longer, there's no physical world or, it's just one world. Like Gen Z see everything as one world, and does your brand interact in all of these narratives? So your business will have to communicate in all of those narratives. So maybe that's what's changed, is that as a business, your marketing of your story has to be way more multifaceted. So that's what I'd say. You have to have a much more deep knowledge of where your audience are, how they want to be talked to, in order to to communicate that. Like back in the day, like I said, with Lovebox, it was an email blaster. So that email blaster doesn't work now. So maybe the psychology is the same, more money, but a different approach to to marketing.
I think we're done on that. Yeah, I think we're done. Well, first of all, Olly, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to Olly and the Prism guys for putting this on. It's been amazing, very, very insightful, and go and check out KOKO.